Good evening, it's Wednesday and you're watching The Big Story with Dylan Ang. I'm Olivia Quay coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. Now, a Chinese couple will be charged under the Infectious Diseases Act. They are the first people to be charged under the act here with regards to the coronavirus outbreak.
The Health Ministry said they had given false information to its officials about their movements and whereabouts from January 22nd to January 29th when they were contacted for the purposes of contact tracing. The wife had also provided false information while under quarantine.
Meanwhile, a 45-year-old Singapore permanent resident who breached stay-home notice requirements from February 20th to 23rd has lost his PR status. The Immigration and Checkpoints Authority has also barred him from re-entering Singapore, while also making headlines. Parliament is in attendance as they debate Budget 2020. Domestic violence is on the rise in Singapore. Find out why. Singapore solves the mystery of the biggest cluster here with the use of a diagnostic test kit. China bans wildlife trade in the wake of COVID-19.
Now, starting today, Parliament will sit for 9 days to debate the 2020 budget in a climate of economic uncertainty made worse by the coronavirus outbreak. Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat will respond on Friday, February 28th, and members of Parliament will then vote on the budget. About 50 MPs typically speak throughout the annual debate, with around 20 MPs slated for today. The hot topics this time include the government's planned aid for workers and businesses during the outbreak. The Labour movement is bringing together 4,000 companies of various sizes to help quickly place retrenched PMETs in new jobs. A new Job Security Council will gather information on jobs and match workers from releasing companies to receiving companies. The 4,000 companies across various sectors employ a total of about 500,000 workers, and 90% of them are SMEs.
It's a growing concern among workers, especially those in their 40s, 50s, and more often PMEs, who find themselves displaced or retrenched because their skills have become redundant as technologies evolved. And if they are retrenched, they can take a long time to get back into a job, and one which may not pay as well or may not even fully utilize their skills. Although these numbers are not large, for the individual worker or PME who have mouths to feed and bills to pay, the situation can cause a lot of fear and anxiety. NTUC wants to ease this situation and help these workers and PMEs. NTUC is therefore piloting the NTUC Job Security Council to improve the matching of displaced or retrenched workers into new jobs.
There were also calls from MPs who urged for speedier short-term support to help firms cope with the coronavirus outbreak, despite the $4 billion stabilisation and support package announced last week by Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance Heng Swee Keat. Some suggestions include expediting support for businesses and workers, as well as expanding the coverage for vulnerable groups.
Well, to tell us more is news editor for the Straits Times, Zakir Hussain. Welcome, Zakir.
Hi.
So, we just highlighted two issues. First, MPs said today that while the stabilisation and support package was comprehensive, they said that more help may be needed. So, what exactly are the MPs' main concerns there?
Okay, I think the main concerns are two things. One is this current outbreak, which has been with us for well over a month now. Right now, there's no certainty on how long it may go on for. Right. In the past week alone, we've seen it spread to South Korea, the Middle East, Europe,
Italy, yeah.
And you know, even with just you know, China being affected, a lot of hotels here have seen occupancy drop from 85% to lows of like 30-35%. Some tourist attractions have seen numbers drop by 80-90%. It's, you know, even locals afraid of going out and so on. So there is a real pinch that businesses on the ground are feeling, and there's a sense that some of the MPs reflected that the initial job support for 3 months may not be enough. The other concern was the timing. You know, for administrative reasons, some of these schemes may take time to implement. So, for instance, the payouts to all companies to help them ease the burden will only be out in July, say. Right?
You're talking about the job support scheme.
The job support scheme, yeah. And even though the skills future top-up for the skills future for mid-career workers, that again will only be out later in the year. So they're sort of wondering whether, you know, in some of the speeches today, they made the point or raised suggestions that perhaps more could be done to help them tap on these schemes earlier. There were no sort of official responses today. His DPM Heng will be responding on Friday when he rounds up the budget debate. But he was furiously taking notes, and so were some of the other ministers.
Right. Well, also something else that we brought up, the new Job Security Council to help retrenched PMEDs find new jobs. Can you tell us more, please?
Yeah. So increasingly, and it's not just with COVID, but even before COVID, for the past year or so, a lot of the labour union members and leaders had been discussing, is there a way to help PMEDs, who are, especially PMEDs in their 40s and 50s, who are at risk of, being retrenched. It's a tough struggle for them to sort of be rehired or reemployed, in a quick time frame. And what the labour movement decided was they've got a training institute, E2I, and they tried to get as many companies on board to sort of better match companies that were about to release workers, right, with companies that actually were in need of talent and labour and so on. And sometimes where there's a skills gap, you can help both sides really by retraining that worker, so he gets a better fit and gets better placed with a job. It's still early days. I mean, it's a trial, but the fact that I think more than 4,000 companies have signed up for it. They're from a wide range of sectors. Many of them are SMEs, which on their own wouldn't have these resources to help their workers. I think that's a good start.
Well, I guess how else can the council benefit workers?
I guess in a way, workers would also be better placed to find out, some of these workers might prefer to be in an area where they're familiar with, right? They might prefer to say transit from one IT role to another IT role. Or some might be keen to switch to an entirely different sector, say from, security to data security.
Right.
Cybersecurity.
Okay. Well, the budget debate just started today. Full day of discussions. What else was addressed in Parliament that, piqued your interest?
I think before the budget debate, there were a couple of concerns about COVID raised, right? And how, with the 5-day sick leave, how this might affect some employees, especially those with very limited medical leave requirements. I think the Ministry of Manpower says more details will be out tomorrow. And I think some of the other points that were raised, I mean, even though a lot of the focus of the speeches was on jobs and how workers can benefit, I think some of the MPs did touch on issues like sustainability, as well as this, a sense of community spirit and helping one another, which you saw in recent weeks with SG United, where Singaporeans kind of mobilized to help healthcare workers and so on. I think there's some discussion on maybe how we could highlight these examples and how, in a way, the budget isn't just about the numbers and the financial help, but about how we can encourage more such community spirit and civic mindedness among people.
Absolutely, great points. Thank you so much for joining us, Zakir.
Thanks, Philip.
That was Zakir Hussain, the Straits Times news editor, and you can keep up to date with the budget debate on straitstimes.com. Moving on, a new interagency task force was set up last week to address the problem of violence within families, as well as to give better support to victims. Co-chaired by Senior Parliamentary Secretary for Home Affairs Sun Xuelinig and Senior Parliamentary Secretary for Social and Family Development Muhammad Faisal Ibrahim, the task force aims to increase public awareness of the issue and come up with initiatives like a dedicated national hotline for victims of family violence. This comes against the backdrop of increasingly violent family abuse cases, with victims reporting more acts of violence in their applications for personal protection orders. Well, Ms. Sun Xuelinig is here in the studio to tell us more. Welcome.
Hi, Olivia.
So, Ms. Sun, let's take a step back first of all. What constitutes family violence or abuse? Is it just necessarily physical harm?
Okay, the Women's Charter actually covers 4 types of family violence, which includes causing hurt knowingly, putting a person in a position where he fears being hurt, continual harassment, as well as wrongful confinement. So it's not just about being physically assaulted. If you're harassed continuously, that also constitutes family violence.
I see. So The types of violence in 2019 jumped by 21% last year compared to 2016. Could you explain this spike? Would you even say that it is a significant spike?
Actually, if you take a step back, when a person applies for a personal protection order, actually in his application, he can indicate what type of family violence has he suffered from. So I mentioned earlier that there are 4 types of family violence. So the 21% spike that you talked about, it could be attributed to reasons, for example, such as greater awareness of what constitutes family violence. So in his or her personal application for a personal protection order, he may have indicated more than one type of family violence that he or she had actually suffered from. Another possibility is that the assailant or the perpetrator of violence could have gotten more aggressive. And that's why we actually have to understand the root causes more, and that is why an interagency task force has been set up between the Ministry of Social and Family Development as well as the Ministry of Home Affairs. We hope to work with obviously the government agencies, community service providers, try to understand the root causes more about what are really the triggers of family violence and what might be the best forms of interventions to prevent and deter these abuses from happening.
I see. So there's, I guess under this task force, there's something called, or maybe this is already existing, the Home Team Community Assistance and Referral Scheme, or Home Team Cares. So how does Home Team Cares differ from what's already in place at the moment, and how will that be beneficial for victims of family abuse?
Okay. Currently, every year, about 2,000 reports are made to the police about offences that could include criminal force, hurt, that involves family members. So we want to be able to intervene in a more upstream manner to identify the root causes of this family violence. So we actually piloted this Home Team Cares scheme at Bedok Division in January 2019. So we basically situated social workers, trained social workers, in the police NPC, and we actually referred offenders to the social workers, and the social workers will interview the offender to try to understand what are some of the socio-economic reasons behind why he or she may have committed the offence. So let me give you an example. There was a case whereby a man was being investigated for a rash act. The rash act he committed was that he actually caused issues at his tenant's place during a dispute. And when the social worker interviewed the offender, the social worker found out that actually the offender was suffering from stress. He had young school-going children, and he needed to take care of them. He was suffering from work stress. So the social worker actually intervened by finding after-school support for the offender, so that the offender could actually concentrate on his work more. And that meant that there was a reduction in stress. It was more likely that he would not commit the offence again. So that's how a social worker can actually work with the police to work in an upstream manner and see how we can intervene more effectively in such family violence situations.
So, you use the term upstream, and I guess the social worker comes into the picture much sooner under Home Team Cares. Yes.
The social worker is able to interview the offender, to triage, to refer the offender to downstream more community service organizations that can help him or her. And actually, we're going to expand this so that the next of kin of the offenders can also benefit from it. So in a family violence situations, you could have victims that involve the family. So we'll also speak, the social worker, the Home Team Cares officer, will actually speak to the family members as well and see how to also help the family members of the offenders.
I see. Well, Ms. Su, let's change the subject for a little bit. A big push for quality preschool education was announced at Budget 2020. What are the benefits, and how can young parents make the most out of this scheme?
Okay, one of the key announcements was about increasing the number of government-supported preschools from above 50% now to about 80% in the near future. And when we talk about government-supported preschools, what it actually means is that the anchor operators and the partner operators of these preschool places, they actually have a fee cap. And with that fee cap, actually the preschool fees are actually capped and made more affordable for parents. So in the medium term, when the government steps up the number of places from 50% to 80%, as I mentioned, there will be greater control over how fees have been set in industry. So that's going to be beneficial to young parents. So for instance, a young family, a young needy family may only pay $3 to $5 a month for preschool education. And what's very important is that there's also been an increase in additional subsidies. And the household income cap for the application of the additional subsidies has gone from $7,500 to $12,000. Right. So what that means is that more families are now eligible to apply for additional subsidies, and therefore the overall amount of out-of-pocket expenses that they'll come up with for preschool education will be substantially lowered.
Right, that's great to hear. So thank you so much, Ms. Sun Xuelinig, for coming on. I've been speaking to Senior Parliamentary Secretary for Home Affairs, Ms. Sun Xuelinig, on the new interagency task force to address family violence. Dylan, over to you.
Now, the number of confirmed coronavirus cases in Singapore stands at 91. Now, case 91 is a 58-year-old Singaporean woman who tested positive for COVID-19 on February 22nd. She took a serological test, which allowed the Health Ministry to draw the missing link between the two church clusters, that of Grace Assembly of God and the Life Church and Missions. Meanwhile, 58 patients have been discharged and 7 are in critical condition. In what's likely to be a world first, the serological test, developed by Singapore's Duke NUS Medical School, uses blood samples and can detect coronavirus infections even in recovered patients. Contact tracers successfully used this to identify a married couple as the missing link between the two clusters. The couple are cases 83 and 91. They had attended a Chinese New Year gathering in Mei Hwan Drive on January 25th. The lab tests currently used to confirm infections detect the presence of viral genetic material in biological samples obtained from a patient, like a saliva swab. So these will not work if the patient has recovered. Joining us now to tell us more about this diagnostic kit is Senior Health Correspondent Salma Khalik. Hi Salma.
Hello Dylan.
Welcome to the show. Salma, what is the serology test and what is it used for?
Okay, a serology test essentially checks whether a person has previously been infected. It can be by a bacteria or a virus. So you know when you get sick and a virus or bacteria enters your body, right? Your body mounts a fight against it, so it develops antibodies. So once you get well, and then there's no more virus there, so you can't use the normal test to find out whether you've got the infection, your body still has the antibodies. So the serology test essentially checks your blood to see whether you have an antibody.
Right. Well, I understand that the test has been existing for quite some time now. So in what way is it considered a world's first?
Okay, serology test is used for all kinds of bacteria and viruses, like for example dengue, right? I can go and find out whether you've had dengue serotype 1 or 2, etc., etc. How is this new? Because the virus, the COVID-19, the SARS-2 virus, is a new virus. So they don't know what antibody is needed for that virus. So the Duke team actually found that antibody so that you could test for it. Because if I don't know which antibody, and different viruses and bacteria have different antibodies, if I don't know what to look for, then I can't find it.
Right. Well, on that note, how did the Duke NUS team manage to come up with a test for this antibody?
Right. You know, Singapore was one of the earlier countries to get it outside of China. And I must say the patients here were all very helpful. The doctors asked, are you willing to help with science? And most of them, the vast majority said yes. So while they were sick, they gave samples. So the Duke team, at Duke NUS, they've got a very secure lab, what they call a Bio3 lab. So they can deal with live viruses. After they recovered, the patients also donated their blood. And from that blood, they were able to get the antibody. So they could identify that antibody. Right? And Singapore became a first, not because we developed the test, but because we are the first to use it on a human being. Right? Most people really don't care. You've already recovered. Why do I need to find out? Right? So Singapore did it.
Now, Salma, you know, on a final note, of course, this serology test played a big part in solving the mystery of linkages between the two church clusters. How did they apply this test to this contact tracing scenario?
Exactly. So why would we want to find out someone who's gotten well? Now, you know, Singapore, we're a little bit paranoid about the whole thing. We want to make sure we've got it all contained. So we've got various clusters. Grace Assembly of God Church was a very big cluster, but we don't know where the source of that infection came from. Similarly, there was a Chinese New Year gathering. Again, several people got infected at different times. And then again, we don't know where they came from. So the source could be still out there. So we worry, right? The police were very good. They found that a lot that there were people who were at the Life Church who was at the Chinese New Year gathering. They also found out that there were people from the Grace Assembly Church who were at the Chinese New Year gathering, family and friends there. So then they went there to look at it, but the timing wasn't quite right. So they still didn't know what happened because the two people that were finally discovered were really very mild. Okay, so this is a husband and wife, case 83 and case 91. So 91 had fully recovered, but 91, she was symptomatic at the Chinese New Year gathering. 83 got sick later, and we know 83 was COVID infected, but he wasn't sick at the Chinese New Year gathering. So they were all very puzzled. So when they tested 91, they found out that she actually was sick, although she didn't have very much symptoms. And through her, they traced from the Life Church to the Chinese New Year gathering to the Grace Assembly. So now we know how all those people got infected.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you, Salma, for taking the time to speak with us. Always a pleasure. Of course, I've been speaking to Senior Health Correspondent Salma Khalik, and I'll stay abreast of the latest developments at straitstimes.com.
Looking at the global situation, China today reported 52 new deaths, the lowest figure in more than 3 weeks. Over 2,700 people have died from the virus. All the new deaths were in the outbreak epicenter of Hubei province, which accounted for 401 of the 406 new infections reported today. And that brings the total number of confirmed cases in mainland China so far to around 78,000. The number of fresh cases has declined in the country, with multiple provinces reporting 0 new infections in recent days. Meanwhile, China's wildlife farming industry, valued at $74 billion, has been permanently shut down. On Monday, the nation banned the buying, selling and eating of wild animals in an effort to prevent zoonotic diseases from jumping from animals to people. The coronavirus is thought to have been transmitted to humans by pigs, civets or pangolins at the Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market in Wuhan. Chinese authorities had temporarily banned the buying, selling and transportation of wild animals in markets, restaurants and online marketplaces across the country. Farms that breed and transport wildlife were also quarantined and shut down. The ban was expected to stay in place until the epidemic ends, but it's now permanent. We're now joined by China correspondent for the Straits Times, Elizabeth Law. Good to have you back, Liz. So, Liz, what's the time frame in which these new laws were introduced? It seems like a bit of a rush, actually.
Well, so what happened is that the top lawmaking body, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, they had a meeting on Monday. On Monday, they had 2 items on their agenda. One was that they were just going to look at the drafts, 8 drafts of these wildlife laws. And the second was that they're going to talk about whether or not the 2 sessions will be postponed. Why I bring up the 2 sessions? Because that is an important, this is basically China's parliament. So that session was when they were meant to have basically pass these wildlife laws. But because of the virus, the outbreak, you can't have something like 2,000 people descending on Beijing from all over Wuhan. Firstly, the outbreak is still going on. And secondly is that a lot of these provincial committees, they haven't had their own provincial meetings yet. So you can't come to the national level without having discussed what sort of legislation you are passing or your agenda for the rest of the year. So that couldn't happen. So they've postponed that major parliamentary meeting, which means that if they want to pass this law, they had to rush it through. So during a special fast-track process, these 8 new wildlife laws were passed on Monday.
Now, Liz, let's dive a bit deeper. Now, what exactly do these new laws mean? Right.
So we aren't exactly sure about the nitty-gritty yet because they haven't shown like a proper draft of it. It's not been released. But what I understand is that firstly, it bans the eating, the trade, and the trafficking of wild animals. But that being said, because under the previous version of this legislation, there were some 50-something animals that you could still breed in proper farms, such as bamboo rats, raccoons, and badgers that were still allowed to be bred as long as you were under supervision and you were agreeable to inspectors coming in once a year for licensing reasons and for inspections. So it's not exactly clear whether or not this ban extends to these farms as well, which are quite a part of the Chinese palate, especially towards the south, or whether or not this just refers to animals that are being caught in the wild.
Right. But Liz, do you think that the new laws can completely eradicate the wildlife trade in China?
Well, I mean, as I said, this is a country that has a very long history that dates back thousands of years, where people do believe that eating certain animal parts or certain types of animals would have herbal medicinal properties, or even rejuvenation properties. So whether or not it can actually work, I mean, I spoke to a few people. I spoke to Mr. Rohit Singh of WWF, and he says that, you know, this is a promising start, and there have been laws that have worked in China previously, because he said that initially they were thinking of lifting a ban on the sale of tiger bones, which is very, very serious, and now they've actually postponed that, so tigers are safe for now. So he says that it is promising that they are doing this, but of course you can't just have a ban, because bans usually just drive the markets underground or out of the country, just like what is happening with the pangolins now. After they declared pangolins a protected species, the trade has now moved outside of China, and much of Asia's pangolins have been poached almost to near extinction, and they've moved further out into the African continent. So that is an area of concern. But I mean, I suppose, and he also said this, that with the proper education and the correct level of enforcement, I think it is possible. And again, as I've said this many times before, if there's any country that has the willpower and that sort of mass mobilization ability, it is China.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Liz. That was China correspondent Elizabeth Law speaking on China's new laws that ban the trade and consumption of wild animals.
And those are your top stories. Keep up to date with news in Singapore and around the world at straitstimes.com. I'm Dylan Ang with Oliver Quay. See you tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.